Welcome, everyone. My name is Amit. I have a very simple job. I keep men out of trouble, women happy. So, which means I get to run marketing at 1-800-Flowers. And for those of you who don't know, we are a house of brands. We have about 15 brands, and we do everything from delivering flowers to chocolates, cookies, etc. So think of us as sort of a gifting platform, a continuum around sort of the ability to deliver smiles, and we'll get into a little bit around that. So anyways, this afternoon I have a pretty simple task, I would say, talk about innovation in marketing, which those of us who are in marketing, it's always the buzzword of the year, right? So innovation is everyone's business now also in every firm. So I thought instead of talking about that and sort of teasing out what is innovation in marketing for us, I thought it might be interesting for you guys to hear a little bit about our story and sort of what have been our lessons in terms of marketing in general. And then we'll talk a little bit about how it all comes together on sort of the Twilio stack and sort of ways of thinking about how marketing has evolved, right? And in general, it should be of interest not just to the marketers or business people in the room. I think one of the great facets about Twilio is that it is sort of started out from a very developer-centric, I would say, view of the world, right? Which by and large, if you think about it, most competencies now, whether you're in customer service, marketing, operations, the idea of understanding a developer-led mindset, the coda of being a developer, I think is something that is prescient for all of us. So that's my purpose here. Pretty easy agenda. We'll talk a little bit about our story. We'll talk about this idea of a customer experience continuum. You know, why is this important? Especially when we talk about innovation and marketing, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about a couple of examples to illustrate sort of the subtle point that we are trying to tease out here. And then we'll talk and bring it back in how it impacts marketing, right? So I want to start off with a very little story about how we started out. So we started out about 40 years ago as a single store in Upper East Side in New York City with the idea that flowers and gifting is not just about this idea of marking an occasion or celebrating someone's outcome in life, but it extends to what our mission is, right? So when we think about our mission on a day-to-day basis, it's not about delivery. It's not about sort of the outcomes on the recipient side, but we think about like, how do we help our customers express themselves, right? Aunt Sally, who might have taken care of you when you were sick as a young kid, and now she's in the hospital. You want to express something to her. You want to send something and be like, hey, you were there for me when I was growing up. You know, I wish I could be there, but here's something for you to think about and know that how much you meant to me, right? So that's what inspires us. That's our mission, and that's what's kept us true over the 40 years. Now, how did we play out our mission over the 40 years? So I want to talk a little bit about sort of our evolution from the bricks and mortar store. So we started 40 years ago, I said, as a single store, Flora Plenty, in New York City. And then, you know, one of the things we noticed is this ability to have conversations, right? So when someone comes into the store, generally, you know, they talk about the relationship first. Aunt Sally, my brother, my sister, expression, their birthday is coming up. Something happened to them in their lives. I want to acknowledge that, right? And then we talk about the product. So this was a very important lesson to us. And we had the opportunity to buy one of the world's first 800 numbers back in the glorious days of 1-800-Commerce. And we felt that, you know, having a 24/7 number, a lot of people thought it was crazy. Who would order flowers at 2 o'clock in the night? Why do we need a 24/7 number? But we sincerely believed it allowed us to amplify our conversations on the shop floor with a highly distributed audience, right? So at that time, If you think about 1986, there were around 170 million distributed phones in the US, right? So your ability suddenly to go from a few shop floors to all of these distributed devices. And we are still doing conversations, right? So the theme is still conversations. Then 10 years later, we had another disruption in our business. So if you think about sort of the ability now to distribute not just using voice channel, which was a phone number, but suddenly distribute a much wider channel, which was online at that point, but with a full catalog, right? The number of prompts you can give someone when they come to you on a phone, optimally 3 products that you can discuss, right? Online now, suddenly we can expose our full catalog. You can click through, you can slice it, you can dice it the way you want to, right? But think about what have conversations become at this point. So we went from one-on-one personal conversations, we evolved into a phone, right, where it's still human voice as the main point of how you interact with the other entity. Then we went into a very clinical 2-dimensional form, right? A web page, a grid of products on a catalog, a checkout, right? And then 10 years later, what we saw is that this fixed computational revolution, so we opened one of the first online sites on AOL CompuServe back in the day. Then 10 years later, we also innovated, opened the first transactional site on the BlackBerry, which for a lot of you in this room, you may not remember, but that was the device that told you you made it in your corporate life. You got a BlackBerry, right? So anyways, so we did that transactional site, and now not only the full catalog got reduced, so our conversation voice medium, one-on-one, then went into one-on-many, more distribution, right? But degradation of that quality of communication and conversation. Then just taking out all conversation, saying here's a grid, make your choice, buy something. The next evolution of that is forget the grid, here are 10 links, buy something, right? So we have gone from high quality, deeply enriching conversations, but low scalability to high scalability, extremely scalable, right? Mobile devices outnumber all other fixed computational devices in the world now, right? So we have extremely high distribution, but the quality of the conversation, meh, not that good, right? Very 2-dimensional, very grid-like, very clinical, right? So we were very interested in what happened in the next 10 years, right? And then you have this sudden explosion of going back to the roots of what marketing was supposed to be. The idea of having more enriching conversations. Now the modality is markedly different. It's a lot more fragmented. We have a lot more interfaces. We have voice, AR, VR. We just had a session on IVR. Then we have intelligent virtual agents, so IVA. So many different fragmentations, but all trying to do the same thing. All of them are deeply trying to get back to that shop floor, that one-on-one conversations. And suddenly we have the power to do that, right? So in the last 3 or 4 years, through a combination of ML, AI, and some terrific, I think, bets on partners like Twilio, there is an ability to now have this one-on-one conversations at scale. And this is, if there's one thing you guys should take away from this talk, outside of my brightly colored pants, is that this ability is unparalleled. It took us 40 years from where we started of having the shop floor conversations to start having those same kind of conversations. And there are 3 reasons for that, right? First is identity persistence, right? The ability to have a conversation on a 2-dimensional medium like a chatbot is only delightful when the chatbot remembers something about you, right? So we are not starting from ground zero. We are not starting from a cold start problem always, right? So something as simple as your name, your preferences, right? Chatbots can remember that. So we launched in 2016 something called a GWIN, which is gifts when you need, right? That's our sort of the avatar we've built up to help customers really understand and find the gifts that they need. But it is a persistent layer. It remembers you in the next time you come, right? So the selection is a successive selection, not a cold start selection. Then we were one of the first sites at F8 a couple of years back to launch a Facebook Messenger bot. We also partnered up with Apple and launched on the ABC platform. So we have a bunch of conversational commerce agents that again try to build up this muscle memory of how do you have one-on-one conversations, right? Then if you think about the platforms that are empowering these conversations, they have some deep sets of data, whether you're coming through Google Assistant or on Apple. For example, in Apple, your Apple Pay credentials are saved within that chat medium, right? Think about the power of that. So your identity is not just being mediated by a two-dimensional conversation back and forth. There is something inherent about your identity that the platform is sharing in that conversation, right? It makes it a lot more fluid. The same way if you came to our shop more than once to send something to Aunt Sally, the second time you came, we would say, hey, Mr. Shah, would you like us to use the same credit card that we had on file? So remember this. These are all technologies that are empowering that critical element that we evolved away from, right? We evolved away from this enriching conversations. Now we are trying to get back to that, and we are trying to get back to that delight at scale, right? It's a complete different outcome when you think about sort of your ability to talk to someone on a very highly sensitive computational device versus any other modality, right? So we are all trying to get at that thing. The other thing to also understand, so in 2019, we released something called the Smart Gift. The intelligence around you to have these conversations is not only related to bots, right? It is related to how you implement the entire customer experience. So Smart Gift is a way for us to bring the recipient into the gifting flow, right? So one of the common issues that we see when people come to our store is they don't know what to give. Or if they do know what to give, they don't know what the address to send it to. And if they know what to give, what address to send it to, they still want to know whether the recipient likes what they sent or not, right? So we started employing Smart Gift, and so if you come to our product page, you have the ability to check out without giving us anything more than a phone number and an email of the recipient. And then, we provide a delightful experience using Smart Gift where the recipient gets a text notification to actually reveal that gift even, and then they can choose which address to deliver it to, what date to deliver it to, and whether or not they want that or they want to swap it amongst our family of brands, right? So it not only maximizes the sender's outcome, it also maximizes the recipient's outcome, right? So this set of conversations that we are talking about, this set of relationships with our customers we are talking about, the ability now to scale them, the ability now to delight them using this kind of platforms, whether chatbots, intelligent agents, is an extremely important thing. And the reason I'm saying that is that if you think about 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, your competitor can come and copy your web page. They can say that you are showing a 4x4 product grid. Let me try that as an A/B test, right? But these modern technologies around AI, voice, etc., they are very difficult to copy because they reflect your organizational LQ. What is the learning quotient? How much have you learned? So for example, we know the statistical difference when you come to our chatbot to tell you, hi, Amit, or hello, Amit. Because if you're doing a transactional flow with us, a much more casual inference as hi is considered a lower cognitive load versus a hello. And when you come to us on a customer service issue and you're really anxious, you want to know something, maybe something to reduce that cognitive load, hi works better. So now your competitor comes and says, hey, I look at that skill set, let me copy it. Guess what? They've missed that one-on-one context. They've missed that learning over time. So if anything else you should take away from today is get started. Because any day that you are losing, not building up this competency of learning, of understanding how to build this competency around machine learning, AI within your company to delight your customers, it's going to be one more day harder to catch up with your competitors. So these are very important sort of movements that have to be embraced, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how we got around to it. So now we talked a little bit about how we are trying to get back to conversations, right? Why the hell should any marketer care about that, right? Outside of sort of the feel-good factor that we are now having these conversations, et cetera. So let me illustrate you two things, and then we'll talk about numbers about why they are important, right? So one of the first things that we started attacking is asking the question, if we can have these enriching conversations, right? What parts of our customer outcome will it impact? How do we measure that? How do we keep ourselves honest about what we are learning? And then what accretive outcomes does it have for us as a company, as an enterprise, right? And we are a publicly listed company. We are answerable to our shareholders. So we want to keep ourselves very, very clear, not innovation for its own sake, right? So I thought we'll share some of the guiding principles we talk about when we talk about the customer experience continuum, right? Of which conversations, and at least that's my opinion that I wanted to share with you, is at the core of it, right? So there are three aspects to it. You want to be present, right? And presence, as we talked about, persistence of identity, ability to reach you on multiple channels, right? Everywhere that your customers are, you need to be, right? You have to be relevant, right? You cannot just be interruptive. I think a lot of us in this room remember the good old days of pop-ups, things that interrupt your journey, right? Takeovers of the page, right? Clicking the X, running around, trying to find them. Those days are gone, right? You have to be relevant. And then be meaningful, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Generally, when we think about meaning in marketing, we are thinking of, how do we acquire more customers? How do we retain more customers? How do I get a higher ROI, et cetera, right? But when you really think about what customers think of as a meaningful relationship with a brand, more often than not, they are thinking about the value orientation. What value have you really contributed to their outcome? How have you thought through their value orientation and synced up your own values with it, right? So I'll give you a simple example. When we entered the industry and we started seeing customer service, one of the things that really stuck us is that in gifting, once you order, you cannot modify, right? Because there are two parties, local distribution, a lot of complexity, right? I'll give you a simple stat. Amazon can deliver same day in this country less than 20% of the US zip codes. We do at 96% of the zip codes, right? So we have a much narrower SKU count, but our complexity is very high, right? Because we try to attempt to do same day 96% of the zip codes. And it gets very asymptotically high as you get past 70% of the zip codes. Very high carrying costs, et cetera, a lot of complexity. So when we studied the market, we thought, and we saw, no one really allows you to modify the order, right? Very difficult to modify it. So what we started doing is we used two of the Twilio Studio sort of technologies, SMS, to really create this delightful experience where after placing the order, you can modify it. And we have taken out sort of agents, et cetera, all the things that cause awkwardness when you invoke our conversation around modifying an order. And if you think about it, a lot of times, modification exercises actually bring us closer to the brand because then they reveal the value of the brand, right? If you're going to put up barriers to modifying after I have paid my money, it's kind of a poor customer experience. It's a poor relationship. It's a poor starting point to, or an ending point of your conversation with a customer where you convince them to buy something from you, right? Empower you to hold that trust in going and giving a gift, but they cannot modify it, right? So this was a real eye-opener for us, and then we'll get into the stats. The number of people who chose modify the order and then returned next year because we offered this was statistically 4x higher than a baseline customer returning. Ability to modify now starts impacting your acquisition costs, right? So we come back to this idea of marketing is not such an isolated exercise. It is inherent in how you think about the customer experience and what bets you made, right? But there are simple ways of enhancing that. So this was, a pretty simple exercise for us to get it up and running, right? Let's talk about another sort of back-end but unsexy area of business, which sometimes has a lot of issues, right? So operations, as we were talking about, is really important for us. Orchestrating, we run a perishable commodity. If we cannot sell it and get into the customer's house within 4 days, we have to literally throw that out, right? So we have to orchestrate both demand and supply very tightly in order to do that. One of the key things that we realized is that people have a lot of anxiety once they place a gifting order because they are not consuming the gift, right? In self-consumption, you get it, right? The cognitive feedback loop is closed. But when you are doing gifting, it's a two-party outcome, right? Plus, I think, men get very anxious when they have sent something and there is no response. So we used to get a lot of calls, right? Calls are expensive, inherently unscalable, poor conversations, because emotional inflection is sometimes difficult to sync up with, especially when, you are at peak of Valentine's Day, right? And we're getting thousands of calls. So we did something pretty simple, right? Order confirmation. But if you think about it, because we have florists who are doing the delivery of the gift, we wanted to not only know when the gift item was delivered by the florist, but also know when the sender got it so that we can tell the recipient that the order is confirmed, right? And the reason I put up, this is pretty easy, right? Vismo, a lot of companies have a lot of technology around it. Where is my order? But what this helped us think, and the lesson here to think about it, is that even your internal notifications are critical, because that's what allows you to have a complete conversation with the user, right? If we do not know, so the one on the left, which is the delivery confirmation done by the florist. So the florist has a certain number of orders to fulfill, and we provide this application to all of the delivery drivers. They can notify when they delivered the item, right? And then we utilize that signal alongside our other signals to know when to notify the recipient that the gift has been delivered, when to notify the sender when the gift has been delivered, right? Statistical significance in people exposed to the delivery confirmations versus all other cohorts internally, right? The retention rate of people who are exposed to you because of this kind of activities is higher. Marketing acquisition costs lower. Direct impact on marketing, right? So here we are sort of talking about, coming back 40 years later, right? We went from bricks and mortar, we did TV, 1-800 numbers, online, phone. 40 years later, we find ourselves at a very different place, right? We find ourselves at a place where we can have these conversations at scale. And our learning is that the more you empower your creators and more you do these conversations, it actually completely changes your ability to be a marketing innovator and build a competitive moat around your product, right? So the idea that now we can have these conversations and we can have it at scale and bring delight to the customers actually makes me very excited. When you talk about sort of core marketing functions, I think sometimes we get lost in all of the technologies around us. But what gives me a lot of hope and a lot of excitement is we are really coming back to the idea that we can have these one-on-one conversations. And the amount of delight that you can deliver to the customers by starting today. And the way to start today is very simple. One pipe. That's what we did, right? Integrating Twilio, the suite of products that really helped us unify our ability and learning around building these delightful experiences. So, that's all I have to say. I hope, this lesson was prescient to you guys. And I really appreciate sort of the Twilio team that helped me sort of do all the hard work here. But, my hope is that you share some of this excitement around why I think we are at a very different place in talking about marketing and why these conversations and using this stack can really get you to the next level of how you are treated by your customers and how you want your customers to treat you as a brand. Thank you. We have time for questions? Sure.
When you're considering the channels that you allow customers to work with you in, is there a good reason to kind of like abandon email in favor of messaging applications? Like if you had to choose between messaging, and emails, which one would you choose, and what would be your considerations?
This is a very good question, because oftentimes, and I think the larger construct you're asking is, should we let go of the legacy technologies because of, and newer technologies, right, and the choices around it, right? My point of view is very simple, right, that I'm a better human being having learned 5 things than when I learned 4 things. So as a company, as a collective company, we are going to keep on being accretive in how we learn new activities, but we still spend a lot of time thinking about email. One of the integrations Twilio has with SendGrid, et cetera, it allows you to have the similarity of communication across the channels, right? And this is like, look, this is a tough question because no company, including ours, has the resources to do it all. But because of what I said, that it is so important competitively to build the muscle memory around these new things, that I almost think if you're good at email, you will actually have a shorter path to being good on chatbots as well. So you should not abandon that. I think that has to be a concurrent sort of exercise going on.
Okay, thank you.
There's a question down there.
We didn't really touch on it today in this presentation, but I believe 1-800 did a Alexa skill, and I know that's something they're talking about supporting. I'm curious, just from your experience and how you view conversation, so obviously a beautiful two-way piece, how has adoption been? Are you seeing it about questions versus orders? Like, how is the world interacting with this fantastic skill you guys have built?
So as a public company, I have to be very careful here. The first clue is that it is not on the presentation, so that should tell you something about our learnings. I think voice is incredibly important. When I look at the interface choices of my 8-year-old daughter, it is undoubtedly centered around voice and just the comfort she has just with interacting with that, right? There's a lot of privacy considerations, especially in gifting, that we have around some of the recent reports around all the conversations being archived, et cetera, right? So I think we are still in day 0, if not day -1 around voice conversations. Incredibly important. But the key learning that we have had, just to finish off that conversation, is that voice is still very command-oriented. In command-oriented interactions, what we find is actually to achieve delight is very difficult, right? So if you think about most of the Alexa skill sets, you are commanding them. Do this, do that, right? It is not gotten past command to one-on-one sort of, similar hierarchical conversation. So until that happens, I think it's going to be very difficult to convince customers not to just treat it as a piece of, command and control outcome, right? Generally, in those kind of outcomes, what we see is that customer return rates are very low. Only when you have a conversation where you hierarchically feel on the same plane, do you feel like it's a good conversation.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I like how you are addressing things that are simple, straightforward. So simple question, if I'm texting with you, can I call you? Or can I ask you to call me?
Yes.
Great. And how do you handle that?
Through a variety of, I would say, human and non-human technologies, right? Like sometimes when we think that the inference is around the same day, we have an escalation team that will route the calls and sort of call you back. Outside of that, we have automated systems that will prioritize and call back. But generally, we try not to get into that stage because we want to answer every call or deflect every call, if you will, right? But, clearly this is an area which is fertile for doing more work. We are not that good at that, even though our name is a phone number. Sure.
I thought the example you gave of how implementing the SMS API to modify orders materially reduced your CAC or actually improved the likelihood of a return order by 4x or some. Could you maybe either elaborate on that or maybe discuss any other examples of how enhancing the customer experience through Twilio has led to either CAC reduction or an impact to your brand perception?
Yeah, I think more than perception, what we see, because we are a very high intention category, right? So your ability to return is, if you're going to have a next birthday, you're going to come back, etc. Right? So we see that in a very tight timeline. In 13 months or so, we can see, whether your propensity to come back or not. I would say the one other place that we have seen a lot is sort of, the idea of sort of unifying your voice around chatbots. So right now we are working on unifying sort of our Facebook and our Google Assistant voice sets. And in that, what we see is that more likely than not, the same customer that we are reaching across display ads on Facebook and Google on search is also active on Facebook Messenger or Google Assistant, right? So ability now, some of the early experiments where we have seen where we are able to achieve persistence across platforms has also reduced our ability, or reduced our CAC with them, right? So that is one place that we see. The other place we see is cost reduction, because the amount of phone calls that they are sending in is being reduced, right? Now, reduction of phone calls also means that we have persistent identity if they came in through Facebook Messenger, for example, and then using the Facebook pipes, we can retarget that cohort. So now I built up an audience of people who have just come through Messenger and then use the platform to retarget them, right? So that's a deeper signal than just someone being tagged as interested in 1-800-Flowers, right? So I've interacted. So it's a stronger signal when you're building up a custom audience, right? So those are the couple of ways that sort of we are doing it. But I still want to emphasize this is day zero in my mind, right? We are ourselves learning of whether or not some of these touch points actually increase the LTV or not. The short-term CAC is going down, but I'm more interested in over 2 years, will this cohort behave better with us? Will it have deeper conversations with us, for example?
That's interesting. And then given that your customers are now reaching out to you through, I guess, in an omni-channel environment, whether Facebook Messenger or your app or whatnot, are you able to tag them in all these different channels and then consolidate that and track their activity?
I want to say that we talk a good game on that, but it's very difficult to really stitch, identities. And even more than that, stitching of identity does not equal to stitching of the experience. I almost think counterintuitively, when people call through different experiences, they actually have different expectation. Because, one size fits all, the idea that we have of omni-channel communication is actually what I call lazy channel communication. Because, there are ways of interacting. For example, in WhatsApp, I have a lot of young nieces and nephews. There is a certain coda to how you talk in WhatsApp. If I bring the same coda from what I learned in SMS, that's going to be, I think, a little bit not acceptable, So the nuances of each channel also matter in doing that, but I would say we are still, ways away from having the omnipresent understanding of identity. We are not going to achieve that also because of the privacy concerns.
Hey, so if I elaborate a bit on what you just said, can you explain how you're managing all the different channels in your company? Like, are you managing WhatsApp and SMS and Facebook Messenger and email all via the same platform?
Not yet. I would say we are on our journey to consolidate this, but you have to understand, we are talking of technologies that were not around 3 years ago.
Yeah,
right? So some of it we have built our own, in fact, CSPs to handle that. And some we have integrated within our existing CSP and then monitoring tools, etc. But it's still, I would say, a house of response strategies versus a single response strategy.
So essentially, how do you balance in your company channels versus agent experience versus automation? Because, for example, if the agent needs to work with two different systems, then it's a bigger effort for the agent. Maybe it's better for automation, or you can deploy chatbots easier this way. So how do you balance the scale?
Most days I pray a lot, and I hope that the stuff works. But I would say we are, as I was saying, we are building up our learning quotient around it. So right now we are thinking about sort of, the channels where we get the most customer touch points, right? Which are decidedly around, I think, text chatbots right now versus voice chatbots. So that's where we are spending a lot of time integrating sort of the customer profile so we can understand that. And we are also giving ourselves the chance to fail, right? So I've kept certain sort of stacks, if you will, away from the main stack, right? Because you also don't want to take away the creativity of a small team and maybe they cannot get to scale. Maybe, a cohort of customers will have a suboptimal experience, but our learning will be optimal. So you have to balance the two.
So you prioritize channels as the first priority?
Yes.
And then between automation and chatbots and the agent experience, which one would you choose?
Automation.
Automation? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. I wonder how you think about location. You mentioned earlier your distributors are your 96% of zip codes or something, and I just wondered, do you see location becoming an important parameter in how you engage with your customers, and the extent you aim for personalization and all that? It seems like your localization ability.
I think it's very important. I think it's a very strong signal, both in marketing and in understanding the customer's context. Like I was recently at a water resort with my daughter, right? And they were able to tell me that they had both rides inside and outside. They were able to tell me based on the anticipated rainfall where I should queue up, right? Which I thought was, for a water park, the most sophisticated thing I'd encountered, right? So there's ways of using the location which I think are much more intelligent, where we are trying to get to. But I still find, like right now, most of the location is about collecting the information, but doing very little with it, right? So we want to find the equilibrium in sort of between the two. But I think it's a very strong signal, no doubt. This is it. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.